This week's Pokemon is Persian. Introduced as Giovanni's pet, much to the chagrin of its pre-evolution Meowth, Persian has been a less prominent fan favorite since Pokemon began. Not a superstar like Charizard, but a cherished member of the original 151, even though it's not actually a Persian cat. Though speaking of fan favorites, I think its pre-evolution Meowth actually takes the cake, considering it talks and it's one of the most prominent and popular characters in the anime. I'm sure everyone remembers the time Giovanni's Persian was something that Meowth was trying to overcome, as it wanted to be the boss's pet, though he's failed to prove himself many times thanks to Ash and friends. Anyway, today we're going to be examining its history and the competitive scene. So, how good was Persian actually? And in this video we'll be covering these competitive formats. Persian has an excellent niche in its debut generation. Despite its frailty and unimpressive attack, its blazing speed ties Starmie, which means it outruns the king of the tier, Tauros, and plays like it with its normal type physical attacking. This is incredibly valuable in late game scenarios, when Tauros often has a huge upper hand over a weakened team. It is clear to see how big a boon it might be to have what is pretty much almost a second Tauros that can outspeed the opposing team. Its true value here, however, lies in Slash. In this generation, Slash will always score a critical hit, and thus Persian's meager base attack is made up for, while Hyper Beam's strong base power alongside a high critical hit rate lets it have a slightly more powerful finishing move. For example, it only does 3 to 4% more on average, and Slash's maximum damage is usually around 2 to 4% more powerful than Hyper Beam's minimum. Although of course Hyper Beam achieves damage Slash just can't hit, and doesn't get its damage from being a crit. Now obviously a crit Hyper Beam is far more powerful, but Slash is more consistent, and Persian's absolutely terrific speed stat gives it a quite high critical hit rate equivalent to the dangerous crit happy Starmie, who scores one around 22% of the time. And don't worry about lack of coverage, as that is less important than RBY, where hitting many types isn't as crucial thanks to the power and coverage of normal and psychic, and even ice when considering who the top Pokemon are. The simple doubled up normal stab is mostly what Persian needs to succeed in a Tauros and even Snorlax-esque fashion, even if it's not as powerful. It also has Bubble Beam to obliterate the rock types, though unfortunately Persian is totally walled by Gengar, since unlike Tauros it can't learn Earthquake. But Gengar is severely limited in viability, and thus most top RBY players don't use him as much, as it can be a major liability when such an unreliable Pokemon makes it feel like you're playing 5 to 6 down. Persian's guaranteed crit antics are crucial when Chansey and Snorlax can run Reflect so often, and thus it's seen a great amount of high level usage, despite its very limited defensive utility. It must be mentioned that even with the critical hit Slash, Persian is not actually that strong, and thus isn't really a wall breaker on the same level as Tauros, but rather uses its speed to be a terrific finisher when Pokemon such as Exeggutor and Starmie are weakened or out of the picture. Being a so-called quote-unquote second Tauros is an amazing niche to have in a metagame where Tauros is the undisputed king. And while an unlucky non-crit happy bull might get rest stalled on a bad day, Persian doesn't take any of that. While RBY is cruel to most Pokemon outside its select few, Persian manages to break into the ranks with a unique niche that's actually highly useful, although it does require a deft hand and knowledge of damage calculations against the key targets in the metagame to wield effectively. Now on to Gold and Silver. Unfortunately, critical hit and Hyper Beam mechanics changed in the second generation, and thus Persian's viability completely plummeted. It was completely, utterly, totally helpless in the OU metagame, and could not accomplish a single thing against even the most poorly built team. With the new steel types and no critical hit ratio to compensate for its low attack, Persian was flat on its back with no way to get up, and thus carried over to Underused, where even with the decreased overall power level, Persian's move pool alongside its stats and typing offered nothing interesting or usable whatsoever, outside the incredibly gimmicky Swagger plus Psych Up combination, which would never be part of a reliable, consistent winning team. Thus, it was doomed to flop around and never used, where it merely exists without true purpose within the metagame. Persian was among many normal types that were completely shoved to the wayside when King Tyranitar's new Sandstream, Skarmory's new buffed Spikes, and Gengar's new Will-O-Wisps entered the picture, alongside others such as Jirachi and Metagross that were completely immune to so much as a scratch from them. Thus it fell to Underused, where it wasn't exactly good. Weak, frail, the whole story. But Advance's UU has got something for everyone, and Persian Speed gave it somewhat of a niche. With Hypnosis it can put something out of commission, and with Choice Band it's just strong enough to pick off less bulky offensive Pokemon, such as Scyther. It won't be breaking past harder walls, but it can put its speed to use. It also has some influence on the meta, in that certain Pokemon that outrun Select-Berry invests in enough EVs to outrun it at +1, whereas otherwise they could save a lot since nothing else in the tier is faster than Persian. It's not the best choice in the metagame, and having to compete with the ruler of the tier, Kangaskhan, means it won't pop up on too many teams, but it has its niche, which speaks to the possibilities present in advanced underuse, more than Persian's own ability. And with more and more Pokemon that completely shredded normal types not named Blissey with each passing generation, Persian was never even given a semblance of a passing thought when DPP came around. If OU was Earth, Persian's viability in it would be MAC 20647-JD, the galaxy that is the furthest known point from our planet, at a distance of 13.3 billion light years. However, similarly to the previous generation, DPP underuse housed all sorts of Pokemon, even those that weren't great, and Persian was among them. While its technician ability seemed primed for fake-out antics alongside taunt and U-turn to make it a great scout, it was completely and utterly outclassed at this role by Ambipom, who was much more powerful. Persian had to rely on trickery that Ambipom didn't have to be useful. Again, hypnosis, but also the new switcheroo, an equivalent of trick that could catch a wall off guard. With a choice band set that packed both, it could potentially disable 2 of the opponent's 6 Pokemon very quickly. Persian even has some semblance of viability as a rain or sun setter, thanks to its incredible speed and hypnosis, which, alongside taunt and U-turn, are pretty ideal conditions for getting the weather setup off, and having the incoming sweeper positioned as safely as possible against incoming status or phasing shenanigans. Its main niche, however, was the Nasty Plot set. Similarly, the Ninetales, a set that can boost so powerfully and dish out sleep, can be pretty dangerous even when coming from a pretty lackluster Pokemon. Persian is still blazing fast, only being outpaced by Dugtrio, Alakazam, and Swallow, and thus it can potentially make things hairy for the opponent. Its access to a technician boosted Water Pulse lets it blow away counters that otherwise completely stuff physical sets, namely Donphan and Rhyperior, and swift hits neutral targets at least decently after a Nasty Plot. However, with the prominence of the ghost types Mismagius and Rotom, sometimes Water Pulse can be ditched for Dark Pulse or Shadow Ball. Of course, the set is not a world beater and still isn't that powerful after a boost, not to mention it has to rely on Hypnosis's meager at best accuracy, which is why Persian isn't really used at the highest echelon of DPP underuse. However, it does have a niche for interested trainers who want to explore every nook and cranny of a metagame that is one of the kindest to Pokemon that aren't as blessed as others. It should come as no surprise that Persian is thoroughly worthless in this generation. This video might in fact be the first time it's ever been mentioned in relation to Black and White overuse. Not only were its old nemesis still going strong, there were of course new ones that brushed it away without so much of a struggle or even a second thought. Clashes of Permanent Weather, Ferrothorn, Terrakion, Latios, the usual. It fell through the lower tiers faster than anything. Pokemon it previously struggled to compete with were struggling themselves, and thus Persian predictably plummeted to the darkest, most desolate depths of never use, where it was never ever seen, despite technically having a niche. However, Liepard was preferred over it, as it was actually useful in a variety of ways. Thus, there is nothing more to say about Persian's depressing non-existence in this generation. And on to Gen 6, Persian found itself outclassed even in PU by its fellow cat Perugly, since Perugly is far more powerful, nearly as fast, and packs Defiant to punish Defog. Its Nasty Plot set does have Hyper Voice for a more powerful stab, and Hidden Power's nerf bringing it down to base 60 meant it got a technician boost, but Persian was still frail and weak with no resistances. Yeah, those are attributes you usually don't pin on a good Pokemon, and thus it struggled even in the tier meant for the worst of the worst. And unless Persian had been one of your favorite Pokemon since you were a kid, if you were competitive at any of Gen 6's tiers, it probably never crossed your mind once. But at last something! Game Freak must have been sick of so many of its original 151 being so completely terrible, and thus Persian gained in Alolan form. However, before we go on to discuss it, we must first address how terrible regular Persian has become, as it is now officially untiered, which is defined as follows. Untiered is a list of all Pokemon that are not relevant or viable in PU, and is not a playable tier. Generally, the use of untiered Pokemon in a competitive metagame is strongly discouraged. Being too awful for PU is, well, I guess some would call that an achievement. So let's just go with that rather than pile on it some more. Now, the Alolan form isn't exactly the king of the world, and it too finds itself in PU. But first off, it's not just usable, but it's actually straight up good there. Plus, it even has a small niche and rarely used, which is miles ahead of what its Kanto counterpart has been able to claim for several generations. It's a pure dark type with the ability Fur Coat, which doubles its defense and thus gives it quite a lot of physical tankiness. It also has the excellent move Parting Shot, which is basically a non-damaging U-turn that drops the opponent's attack and special attack. This is hugely useful for keeping the momentum and crippling the opponent. Stab, knockoff, and foul play are both pretty great assets as well. These assets combined to, in PU, make it a great check to Pokemon such as Skuntank, Regirock, Golurk, and Alolan Raticate. It uses Taunt and Toxic as well to give a hard time to opposing walls that otherwise stop it in its tracks and don't care too much for dropped offensive stats. These are especially effective when coming off its 115 speed. That still gets the jump on a good deal of the metagame. Z Parting Shot can also be used to bring the Pokemon that replaces Persian back to full health, which is highly unique and an absolutely incredible weapon to have. Having Darkinium Z can also give Persian's foul play the boost into 175 base power Black Hole Eclipse in case it needs to dish out a strong hit. Although this scenario is significantly less common because Z Parting Shot is just so good. And as a matter of fact, that's what gives Alolan Persian its small role in RU, despite not actually checking much outside of Delmise. The team support is ridiculous. While it's not exactly great, it is nice whenever a new generation gives an old Pokemon new tools and it then succeeds in some way, even if it's with an entirely new face. And this new form finally gave Persian some VGC usage, with Fake Out, Taunt, and Parting Shot alongside a 50% health berry, or alternatively Darkinium Z for that unmatched Z Parting Shot support. It could soak up physical hits and support its team to the moon and back, namely monsters like Snorlax, who was menacing enough without its check having its offense lowered and thus became even more of a monstrosity with its support. Other options such as Feint, Snarl, Knockoff, Icy Wind, and of course Foul Play could find use on Persian, but those were more a side dish to the bread and butter. Moving on to placements, there is actually so many to count, and we'll leave a link to all the ones we found in the description below, but those who got top 3 in VGC 2017 amazingly include, and I'm so sorry if I butchered the pronunciation, but Luca Chetty-Belly placed first, and Jamie Boyd placed second with Persian. At the Memphis Regionals, Brady Smith placed first, and at Worlds, the highest stage, Persian placed third at the hands of Paul Ruiz. All these placements showed that Persian was actually pretty good, at least in VGC 2017. And that's it. So how good was Persian actually? Let's not mince words. It sucked. After the first generation where it was pretty good, it was legitimately dreadful. One of the worst things you could use, to be honest. If you were using it, it was probably because you really wanted to use Persian, not because it was the best Pokemon you could use. It is one of the best examples that unfortunately not every Pokemon is created equally. And in fact, some of them are created to be pretty awful, unintentionally or not. However, in VGC 2017, it finally had a breakthrough and found itself finishing an incredible top 3 at Worlds, and also various other high placements at notable tournaments. So if that's possible for Persian, anything is really. I guess you just kind of need a complete rework. Thanks for watching, everyone. And as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False White Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And of course, as I always say, comment on what Pokemon you want to see next. Also, thank you to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And follow my crew on these social media platforms, yada yada yada. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.